Anyway, thank you very much, and welcome everybody, particularly people from Bath Geological Society. Good to have you here this morning. Hope you learned something new. This is the World Heritage Site that is the city of Bath, and I'm sure even if you don't live there, you must have visited it on several occasions. But I wonder, how many times did you actually appreciate and think how much the geology has to do with the development of the city? Of course, it owes its origin and its name to the hot springs. Now, legend has it that Prince Bladud founded Bath in something like the 9th century BC. He'd caught leprosy on a trip to Athens and was self-isolating in the Swainswick Valley. Then his pigs discovered the hot springs. He thought he'd have a go himself. It cured his leprosy, and he went on to found the settlement and then become the 9th king of the Britons. It's also supposedly his son is the inspiration for King Lear. Now, if you look at the map, you can see where Swainswick is, just above Bath there. And there are a couple of hill forts, Iron Age hill forts, Little Solsbury Hill I'll talk about later, and Bathampton Down, which could have been where he lived. Then the Romans came afterwards. You know, the Romans like a nice bath, and they co-opted the cult of Sul or Sulis that was already pre-existing and added their goddess Minerva onto it, and ended up by building what I think are the largest baths outside of Rome. And they saw a number of visitors from all over Europe, apparently. But it was the Georgians, sorry, beg your pardon, by the for about 450, 500 AD, the Roman baths had become dilapidated. But the name lives on in various Middle Ages manuscripts. And I think sometime before 1138, the baths were rebuilt by the Bishop of Bath and Wells. And this map, which is the earliest one I could find, is dated 1588. And it shows 4 of the baths in the city. And then these were later protected by a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I. But it was the Georgians who really took it to the next level, particularly Beau Nash. Now, he'd been born in Swansea, but he moved to Bath and became a local celebrity. He was very much an influencer of his day. He was the master of ceremonies. He promoted Bath. He had a string of notorious mistresses, quite a character apparently. Together with a Dr. Oliver, who wrote about the curative properties of the water, meant that the baths were rebuilt a number of times, getting more and more grand. And during one of those rebuilds in 1755, they actually uncovered the remains of the Roman baths. So during Regency period, the town developed as a spa town, based on the curative properties or alleged curative properties. This is when all the elegant buildings that we know were built, and it was the place to be and be seen, and the premier resort of frivolity and fashion it was described as. What you see today, if you go to see the Roman baths, is basically a Georgian and possibly a Victorian reconstruction of what was there in Roman times. Now, you could still get treatments on the NHS as late as 1976, but in 78, a young girl died of meningitis that she caught from an amoeba in the water, and the baths closed for several years. Now, I also heard a story that a new water supply well was drilled for a brewery, and this caused the springs to dry up, but I haven't been able to find any confirmation of that rumor. But I do know that in the 70s and the 80s, there were a couple of borehole investigations, one looking into subsidence of the baths and one trying to find a clean source of water from a greater depth. And at that time, in 1982, the County of Avon Act was passed to add sort of further legal protection to the springs. And this means that it's illegal to excavate or drill below certain depths within the city. So right in the center, that's no more than 5 meters. In the valley, the blue area on this map, it's no more than 15 meters, and the rest of the city is no more than 50 meters. Fine is £500. And then in the 21st century, the public were let back into the water with the opening of the new Thermae Bath Spa. Now, it's generally thought that the origin of the hot springs is rather like this. You get rain falling on the Mendips, takes about 1,000 years to soak down into the Carboniferous limestone. It gets to about 3 kilometers depth, reaches a temperature of 60 or 70 degrees Celsius. Then it comes up rather rapidly, some thrust faults issuing at the city at 46.5. But a number of people think this model is far too simplistic, and they point to the fact that the baths actually sit on what's known as the Avon Solent Fracture Zone, which is a large crustal fracture that actually extends as far as South Wales and into Normandy as well. But you get hot springs in Southampton, you get them in Bath, you get them in Bristol, and you get them in Taffs Well, all along the same line. So the Mendip model really doesn't explain the details. The Bath Springs are the hottest in the UK. In fact, they're the only true hot spring, being defined as being greater than 30 degrees. Unlike Bristol, which is much cooler, but within the same basin, really. And the Bath Springs are a very, very limited area. Now, it was known from about the time of William Smith that the waters rose up what are called spring pipes. Now, these are cavities that have been choked with gravel and rock debris and things like this. But in the 70s and 80s, the boreholes I mentioned earlier threw a lot more light on the scene. And this is actually an inclined borehole that was drilled in Stall Street down into the pipe at depth. And this is a cross section through Bath showing some of these boreholes that were drilled looking into the hot springs, with the hot springs area there highlighted with a red ellipse. Now it seems like there's a knoll of Carboniferous limestone which probably existed as an independent hill back in the Triassic, and it was subject to karst conditions, so deep karstal weathering. And indeed, when they drilled the boreholes, they found cavities, they found bits of river gravel, and even a Roman tile down as deep as 70 meters below ground level. And then the Jurassic aquiclude and the clays at the top of the diagram, they effectively prevent the mixing of the hot springs with the cold meteoric water, which retains the temperature. And so because the Carboniferous limestone is quite shallow in this location, this is really why it's believed that the hot springs are so localized. Generally thought that the river Avon cut down very rapidly during meltwater periods in the Devonsian when the ice was melting, probably about 100 meters of permafrost still around. And together with the stress relief that this caused, plus the freeze-thaw cycles, it's opened up the fractures in the Carboniferous at depth, and it also caused the Jurassic strata to bulge up. Now, I'll talk about that in a minute. So the warm water then could rise up, it melted the permafrost, and then it started to flow, and over time, internal erosion sort of opened up the cavities, removed the fines, and then allowed them to collapse, really, and create these spring pipes that we see today. Some people actually say you don't need an artesian head in the Mendips to drive the water. It's simply thermal density contrast, because hot water rises. That's what it does. Anyway, moving on, probably the most famous Georgian person that we deal with in Bath is William Smith, the geologist. He lived in Monkton Combe, and those of you who are on Morris's trip that Chris has just mentioned back in September, we saw where he lived, and we saw Tucking Mill. This is where he dictated the order of strata. It's 29 Great Pulteney Street. And this was the first ever stratigraphic table. And so you could say that the geology of Bath has been studied for probably longer than anywhere else in the world. These buildings are interesting for another reason. If you stand and look at the plaque, which is just here on the wall, and look along the facade of the buildings, you'll see the cobblestones aren't actually horizontal. They waver up and down by as much as about 120 millimeters. This is because these buildings were built on compressible alluvial soils, And since construction, they've all differentially settled and not separated, but they waver up and down. And Smith also produced the first geological map in the world in 1799, centered on the Guildhall with a radius of 5 miles. And he's known as the father of English geology, but he's also known as the father of engineering geology, because a lot of his work was practically based. He was building canals, he was looking for minerals on people's land, this sort of thing. So he's also known as the father of engineering geology, and his profile appears on the logo of the engineering group of the Geological Society for that reason. And he, of course, made the famous map in 1815 of most of the country. This is the bit centered on Bath. Sure, you've seen it before, and there's a little cross section here on the right showing Bath in its setting. But if you actually compare this to the modern day BGS map, you can just see how good he was. I mean, it's a remarkable match for one man on a horse back in the 1815s or whenever he did it. Bath is famous, or should I say infamous, for something known as founded strata and for its landslips. And I'll explain this as we go along. The geology, horizontally bedded Jurassic, basically. So you have the Bath stone, the great oolite, basically the Charfield oolite or the Coombe Down oolite, depending on where you are. This is on top of the hills, and this is in the bright yellow here. And beneath that is the Fuller's Earth. Fuller's Earth is a mudstone, but it's rich in montmorillonitic clays, and the montmorillonite comes from the weathering of volcanic ash. But it's also an expansive lattice clay mineral, and so it expands and contracts when it gets wet and dry. This leads to a number of landslides. Beneath that is another limestone, the inferior oolite in the orange. And then beneath that are silts and sands from the Bridport and Durham formations. These are very highly frost susceptible. And at the bottom of the valley is the Charmouth mudstone, which is basically the old-fashioned lias clay as we know it. Now, probably more important is actually what happened to this geology during the Quaternary, when Britain was in a periglacial climate, much like you might get, say, Greenland or northern Canada, as in this photograph here. This is probably what Bath would look like, or would have looked like. And if you look at the map, you can see it's just to the south of the permanent ice sheet in a region known as Region 5. And this is a more detailed map. You can see Bath, and you can see how close it is to the yellow line, which is the southern limit of the Anglian glaciation. You've also got the southern limit of the Devensian glaciation here, the little black line, less easy to see. And so up here, you've just got glacial deposits, and down in this zone, you've got a lot of just only periglacial deposits. So we're very close to the ice sheet. The Quaternary stratigraphy is dominated by changes in climate from warm stages to cold stages. And this graph shows the past 500,000 years. And it's based on what are called marine isotope stages. So if you measure the ratio of oxygen 16 and oxygen 18 in marine sediments, this is a proxy for ocean temperature. So the peaks on the left-hand side are warm weather, and the peaks or climate, and the peaks on the right are cold. And there have been about 13 stages in the last 500,000 years, 6 of these cold stages, with famous names, the Anglian, the Devensian, the Wolstonian, those sort of things. You then find something like 104 stages throughout the whole of the Quaternary. So the climate was going backwards and forwards, warm, cold. And in areas like Bath, where you get horizontally bedded clays and silts with a cap rock of a more competent limestone, a periglacial process is known as cambering is very common. And it develops basically a camber drape forms on the sides of the hills. What happens is it's thought that erosion by meltwater streams causes stress relief, and then the melting of the permafrost, which occurs from both the top and the bottom, creates a sort of zone of very high pore water pressures. And combine these two things result in a a plastic flow. So the clay will sort of move sideways towards the valley. It will also heave in the bottom of the valley and create what is known as a valley bulge. And all the time, the erosion is removing the excess material, so the process just keeps on going. And then what happens is, as the clay is moving, the limestone sort of is carried along like a conveyor belt. And as it does that, it breaks up. You get gaps between the blocks where the joints are opened, and these are known as gulls. Sometimes they're voids, sometimes they're full of sediment from above. The lumps of limestone tend to sink into the clay a bit. They rotate forwards, and the whole thing generally sort of dips down and thins into the valley. And this is known as a camber drape. And so what happens is that you get the limestone occurring at a level which is much lower than the true stratigraphic level. And so it looks for all the world like a syncline, but it's not a syncline, it's not tectonic, it's what's known as a superficial structure. And the way it's thought to work is shown here in a series of 4 little cartoons. Basically, if you imagine the river cutting through, the stress relief causes a bulge at the bottom as the ground comes up, and it also opens the gaps in the limestone. Now, this would happen today if you dig a quarry in this sort of material. You get movements, or even a deep basement in the Oxford clay or the London clay or something, you get movements. But when you get this combined with frost heave because of the growth of ground ice, you tend to get an accentuation of the heave at the base, and you tend to get more opening of the cap rock. And then as valley erosion continues, you get creep developing, as I mentioned before, the ice-rich strata, and it sort of moves in towards the valley. The cambering starts and the bulge increases, gulls form. And then later on, when the permafrost melts, you get very high water pressures. And so you can really get sort of plastic flow coming in here, and these ductile movements make a much bigger bulge. The limestone begins to rotate, the blocks start to sink, the camber drape develops further. So this is what you get around the Bath area. There is a significant periglacial legacy around here, and it's all a major hazard to engineering works. So basically, the Great Oolite and the Inferior Oolite are both cambered. They're detached, rotated blocks. There are gulls that may be open, they may be filled with sediment. The Fuller's Earth has a propensity for sort of mud flows which come right down the valley. The Lias clay has deep-seated rotational failures, and it has a valley bulge in the bottom. So we'll be looking at some of these features as we go through. This is a location map just north of Bath that shows the SWGA Valley, which I've already mentioned. This is Little Solsbury Hill, where Prince Privett may or may not have lived. Valley bulge is down here. And this is the A46, which comes down from the M4, if you know it. And there I've noticed noted the top of the dual carriageway, which is where the Bath East and Swainswick bypass comes in, a relatively new road that was constructed there. And there's a site here I'm going to talk about as well, which is known as Soper's Wood. So this is a cross-section through the SWGA Valley based on boreholes drilled in the 1970s for the new road. And you can basically see a very thin veneer of clay sliding on from the Fuller's Earth, which is this bed up here. You can see deep-seated landslides. And you can see, importantly, in the Midford Sands, which is the Durham silts these days, the bedding gets thin and it dips down into the valley. This is a true one-to-one horizontal vertical scale. So this, as I say, is a non-tectonic feature. But the whole lot has moved, the whole lot has been disturbed, and the whole lot is less strong than it would have been if it hadn't moved, which is the key problem. Now, I mentioned foundered strata, and foundered strata is a bit of an enigma. It appears on the small-scale BGS maps, where it used to, and this is what was there. So there's an inconsistency, really. So this is sheet 265, the Bath sheet in the middle. And And you can see between 1965 and 1997, the various printed editions had founded strata in blue as one legend, and it had landslip, which I put in red, as a separate legend. And when you go down to the Froome sheet below, it's all landslide. There is no founded strata. There's no legend on the map to explain what this means, and there was no memoir published to explain what it means, but it must generally have been something to do with the Cambering. But you ask yourself, what happens here? There is a change, and this is simply where the map has changed. So somebody mapping from the south coming north met someone mapping from the north coming south. They had different ideas, and the symbols have stuck on the map. So you ask yourself, is there something special about Bath? Why is there this circle of blue material? Well, the answer to that is actually no. This is very much like most of the Cotswolds, but it's just the way the map has depicted it. And I can demonstrate this from a paper that was published in 1985 by a number of BGS staff. And here's an extract from part of the map, the 1-inch map, and it shows the great oolite in white, and it shows the rest as founded strata with the horizontal hatching. But I happen to have a little extract from the 6-inch map. Excuse the pencil lines and the sellotape marks. That's the only one I've got. But you can see, I don't expect to read it, but you can see there's quite a lot of detail going on here. So there's a lot more, if you like, in the BGS archive, in the files, than actually ever made onto the 1-inch map. And so these authors, as an experiment, they revised the map, and they published it in a little known report called the Environmental Geology Study of Parts of Wiltshire and Avon, which sort of languishes on the BGS servers somewhere. You come across it more by accident than design. You have to really look for it to find it. Another one, the Bath's founded strata, which is much later, but also explains what's going on. If you're interested, they're well worth hunting down. But what they've done, as you can see, they've got rid of the founded strata, and they've got just the landslip shading. But they've increased the information by, they've got some text here that says camber. They've got some arrows showing where the camber drakes are. So all in all, a much better map than the one on the left. But I would ask you to sort of bear in mind this little site that I've marked with a green star. So on the left, this is the published map from the previous editions, and you can see this is what we're looking at just now. And the founded strata is in horizontal yellow with horizontal lines, but it's inconsistent because there's a landslide here, there's a landslide here, there's another similar landslide there that's not mentioned, there's another big one there that's not mentioned, there's another one down there that's not mentioned. So it's not that good. And this is where the mapping changes. As I say, this is all landslide coming up this way, and it's all founded strata coming down there, and that's probably where they stopped and had lunch. So you don't really know, but it took till, say, 2011 until they published the updated version. And this is the updated version. You can see there's a lot more information. They've got the landslide symbol. These slips I mentioned there and there and there are actually now shown. But where we had the yellow star, it looks to me like undisturbed bedrock geology. And if you look at all three together, I would caution you looking at some of these maps, because if you look on the left, the original map, say you're going to build a house there, you look at the first map and think, oh, wow, that's founded strata. I don't know what that is, but it's obviously founded. You look at a second map and you'd say, ah, yeah, it's a camber here. I can see it's a camber drape with a long, thin arrow. That's going to be disturbed rock. But if you were to just buy the map and look at it today, you would actually see it as inferior oolite, and you would say, oh, yeah, that's a solid piece of rock. I'll build my house on there. Maybe not such a good idea. Anyway, let's have a look at some of the hazards that you get from this cambering process. And the first one to look at is gulls. This is a gull in Springfield Quarry. And you can see at the bottom where the bedding is quite massive, it's open, there's a big open void. Where you get to the top, where the bedding is more thin and there's more weathering and more stress relief, you don't see any expression of movement at all. So if you look down from the top, you wouldn't see what's below. plenty of gulls to go and see in Quarry Road, which is the entrance to the university. On the left, this is what it looked like in the 1960s, just after the road was open, and you can see there is material bridging over the top of these gulls. If you go there today, it's a little bit more vegetated, but you can still see them quite well. Also, in Quarry Road is evidence of what we call dip and fault structures. Now, this is where, from the previous drawing, the blocks are rotating, and you get an offset, a sort of offset of, in this case, it's only a few millimeters, but it's a marker bed that looks like it's a fault, but it isn't a fault. It is simply these rotated, tilted blocks in the Cambering process. And here's a site in Waterford Park. This is a housing estate. This is in Radstock, and it's about 13 kilometers south of Bath. So this is actually the blue lias, but it's very similar with the clay underneath it in the same way as the great oolite in Bath. And you can see the developer here found this hole in this trench, which he's going to build a house. So this is going to be the foundation for the trench. That is an A4 pad scale. So we dropped a wire rope ladder down here, and this is what it looks like inside. And you can see there's a long void. It's about 17 meters from end to end that I walked. And you can see the roof here, absolutely full of just fallen blocks of limestone and bits of clay. And for those of you who may remember him, this is the late Brian Hawkins. And here's another one on the same site. So up here we've got a void. And we decided that the only real way to know what was going on was to actually clean these trenches out with spades and brushes, and brush them and get all the clay away, so you can see the cracks in the limestone. And then where these guys are standing, you can see there's something there. There's obviously a lot of disturbance going on, and that is photographed here from a different angle. And you can see a gull that's filled with clay. You can see tilting blocks. You can see this, that's that void there. This is the same trench before and after cleaning, so you can see a lot more information. That then allowed us to decide how we were going to design the reinforced concrete foundations that would span any of these voids to enable these houses to be built safely on top. And in this work, I recognized quite a number of gulls, different classes of gulls that I discovered, based really on the type of movement that you get, combined with whether there's any sediment backfilling them and how much and that sort of thing. So some of them you just get a clean opening. Some of them you get a much more discrete, so it opens over a few layers. It's not so obvious. And others, perhaps the worst kind, you get a big discrete opening at the bottom, but the top few layers, nothing much happens and you don't see it. And this sketches on the right-hand side basically show the sort of forms that we saw in this site. So quite a variety from just generally disturbed ground to some massive open voids. Okay, let's have a look at the shallow translational slides and mud flows that occur mainly associated with the Fuller's Earth. Now, these are better known as active layer slides, and the true sort of geomorphological name. And what happens is that when the permafrost melts, you get an active layer, which is the melted bit in the summer, maybe only a meter or so. This stays cold. But if you've got a sludgy layer and the water can't drain away, you can get huge blocks, as on the left-hand side, just sliding down the hill on a slope parallel shear plane. And these are named as detachment slides. Conversely, on the right, if the whole thing moves as sort of viscous mass without any shear surfaces, it just flows as a fluid, these are known as flow slides. Sometimes they're called solifluction lobes, sometimes they're just called mud flows. But they are prone to be on very, very shallow slopes, as low as 3 degrees. And this is Solsbury Hill, Little Solsbury Hill. Talked about it before. This is the Great Oolite Plateau where the Iron Age fort was. And it's been made famous by Peter Gabriel in the song in the 1970s. But I can tell you I've never actually seen any nocturnal eagles, but What I have seen is what Peter Gabriel missed, and that's the Relict active layered slides. If you look on this picture, I've ringed a number of areas. You should be able to see it's a gentle topography, little lines, little ridges. These are all quaternary flow slides that have been grassed over as the climate has changed. This is what they look like on the ground. This is a slightly different field, but you can see this field is actually crawling with landslides. You might not notice it, but there's something going on there. There's a little bit of a ridge here. Some of them are quasi-stable. They either don't move or they move from time to time. Some of them continue to move. Some of them move in the winter, not the summer. And it's really the water pressure, usually springs, or change in loading, that causes some sort of reactivation of triggers for more movement. But in some instances, there's no surface expression whatsoever, and that can be very dangerous if you don't realize what's beneath your feet. And they're not very good places to build. So here are 3 houses that are basically falling down. They've got plenty of cracks inside and outside. The one in the middle has lost its porch. There's a big scarp in the back garden where the lawn has dropped away. And then in the field in front of them, there is a lobe developing as the material moves down the slope. And it's probably just the weight of these houses that's caused this failure. And the reason for these sort of failures is there are relic clay shear surfaces in the clays. This is a couple of photographs showing these features. They're very, very polished. They're very striated. They're smooth. All the clay minerals are all lined up on the surfaces. They're usually wet, and they've got very, very low friction. And what happens if you shear clay? Look at this graph: displacement along to the right and shear stress, which is basically strength, up the page. If you start to shear some clay, it follows the pink line, and it basically goes up sort of in an elastic way until it fails, and it fails at what's known as the peak strength. And then as it continues to move, if you continue to displace it, it will reduce in strength, and it will gradually then slide along these layers as the shear surfaces are developed, continuing to slide with the friction known as the residual strength. Now, if you come back maybe thousands of years later and you displace this, you remove it, put some more load on it or something, it'll follow the blue line. So it'll only come up as far as the residual strength. So the motto is that a once failed clay slope is much, much weaker than one which has never failed. So if you've got pre-failed slopes, they can be really easily reactivated and landslides can develop. And this is what happens. This is Soper's Wood. This is on the other side of the Solsbury Valley. The wood to the top there, the field of interest is this one I've ringed in yellow. And you can see a number of quite large mud flows in the aerial photo. This is what it looked like in 1978. Best time to photograph these is in the winter when there's no grass and when the angle of the sun is very low. And you can see all these sort of very low relief features picked up by the sun. Even better if you use false color infrared film. In this case, you've got a sort of pinky color from the lush vegetation, and you get a gray, bluey color from bare soil. So you can really see these ridges. And these are very, very shallow, maybe only a few centimeters high in places. This is what it looked like in 1995, this field. This is actually quite a large feature. It's maybe 2 meters high. On the left-hand side, you can see a very nice lateral shear surf developing where it's pushing the turf over. But today, this is the same view. It's beginning to vegetate a little bit, some small trees and shrubs developing. This is the same field that was mapped by a guy called Richard Anson back in '94. He was a PhD student, and this procedure known as engineering geomorphological mapping uses a series of symbols that basically describe where the slip scarps are, where the mud flow loads are, where the the breaks in slope, the slope angles, the slope segments, slope directions. And it's a very good visual tool for showing these surface features. He also produced a cross section based on boreholes, and you can see that in this slip, there's nothing more than about 4 meters deep. Below that, it's undisturbed clay. Now, I happened to make a map of this back in 1978, and you can see the field again ringed in yellow. Again, I don't necessarily think you're going to see all the details. There's a lot of ink on the page here, and you can see there's an awful lot going on. But the reason for showing this picture is actually in the wood, there's a big white space because I wasn't able to map it, because you just can't see what's going on. Now, this is the nostalgia slide for all you old guys who used to make maps and plans. And I say a lot of ink on the paper because in those days you had to use a mapping pen, you had to use stencils and this sort of thing. If you're really rich, you could afford Letraset and Letratone, but otherwise it was all ink. And if you made a mistake, you just scratched it off the tracing paper with a very sharp scalpel blade. There was none of this pressing Control Z to go back and remove your mistakes. Anyway, back to the wood. You can see from these photos, there's a lot of mud flow activity. There's a lot of trees being pushed over. It's a question of how can you put that onto a map? Well, these days it's quite easy because of this technique known as LiDAR, this, laser imaging from planes. You can see shown here is the same view before, and this is what's known as the digital surface model. It's basically the first reflections back from the laser to the plane, and you can see very nicely how the mud flows are picked out, and you can also see the trees and the wood and the buildings and things as well in the surrounding area. But the trick is that some of the laser light does actually get through the canopy and bounces off the underlying ground. So if you keep your eye on the wood while I press the button for the next slide, you can see you can just get rid of the wood, get rid of the buildings, and you can see the underlying ground quite nicely. And you can see there's a whole load of mud flows over here, going down into this valley and going around this hill. There's also some linear features, which I don't know what they are. They could be gulls, they could be, you know, at the edge of the Great Oolite, because this is the Great Oolite Plateau just here. So they're interesting. And if I drop my map back over the top, you can see it would be relatively simple just to ink in where the mud flows are. And this is important because over the other side of the hill, other side of the valley near Solsbury Hill, this is where the A46 Swenswick bypass comes through. Another one of my maps on the right, which I made in advance of the roadworks, with 3 potential routes shown, and the one that was actually built was the one in green. And on the left-hand side, there's an area where the landslides here, transitional landslides, are about 11, 13 meters deep. And so the engineers in this area decided that they were going to stabilize this hillside by putting vertical sand drains in, and these vertical sand drains are at 4 meter centers, and they basically lower the groundwater table so it's below the bottom of the slip surface, thereby stabilizing the slope. But there was another area along here where it's about 110 meters where they decided that it was actually even more unstable because the slips were deeper. So they piled a concrete raft, and the road is built on a concrete slab with piles that go right the way down into the lias clay. This is it being built. And on the right-hand side, you can see the steel coming out of the top of the pile. This is going to be cast into the concrete slab. And that steelwork is there to resist the horizontal movement, the forces of the hill that may be pushing the road off down the slope. Okay, so let's look at some of the rotational landslides. These are deeper, bigger structures generally, and they occur mostly in the lias. Now, in Georgian times, the city was expanding up the hill off the floodplain, and this is Camden Crescent. You probably know it if you live there, but it's the only asymmetric crescent in Bath, and it was designed with 22 houses in the centre and 5 wing houses at each end. But as you can see from this contemporary etching, the right-hand side is somewhat severely truncated. And this is because in 1794 there was a large landslide. This is the backscarp of it from a contemporary picture. That separated out the 9 houses on the right-hand side, the northern end, from the rest of the crescent. What had happened, I think, is that the buildings, the foundations of the buildings had interrupted the natural groundwater flow, causing the pressures to rise and prompting a slip. And if you look at it from the air, you can see the unfinished nature of Camden Crescent. And this piece of vegetated ground in front of it is known as Hedgemead Park. Hedgemead Park is a Victorian pleasure gardens that was built just below the crescent, but it wasn't always a park. It used to be a working class housing area, and between about 1875 and 1885 there were a series of landslides that basically destroyed all these buildings that are shown in the sort of purple colors. First slip was in 1875 that fractured a gas main, caused an explosion, and then there was a landslide about 245 meters across developing. And the effects of groundwater were known at the time, or at least by some people. And on the right-hand side is a borehole. They were looking at, they drilled some boreholes, they were looking at wells in this area and noting that how the water level in the well was correlated with how much movement there was of the houses. And so when they were drilling this borehole, they found, first of all, 3.5 meters of active layer slide, which is sometimes known as hill wash. And this is a clay deposit mixed with rubbly limestone, and that's sitting on top of the lias clay, shown in grey, but there are a number of limestone bands shown with these little orange lines. When they got to this particular band, the water in the borehole rose up 3.5 meters because of the artesian head. And then when they got to the one down the bottom, the rise was 8.5 meters. So there's artesian pressure in the limestone bands. And if you look at the triangle, that's basically represents a cross section through the hill. At this point A, where there's water in the limestone, it's got an upthrust pressure of 35 kilopascals. This is basically Archimedes' principle. And if you look at the weight of the pink stuff, it's actually 60 kilopascals, the pressure downwards. So at this point, it's quite stable because the weight of the clay keeps the water in check. But down here, the upthrust is 85 kilopascals, and this is sufficient to lift the clay, to separate it and destabilize the slope. So a number of the Victorian engineers investigating it came to this conclusion, and they produced a proposal for a drainage scheme based on a couple of shafts and a number of tunnels that would take the water out of the slope. And the idea was to discharge it down here somewhere. They didn't say what happens to the water when it gets to London Street, but that's another story. But nevertheless, they thought about draining the slope. However, the city council people poo-pooed the idea. They said, "Oh, no, you can't get water in the lias clay. That's rubbish." But they just hung back and didn't do anything. What they did do was they repaired some of the leaking sewers. Now, the sewers were ashlar sewers with sort of butt joints, and they replaced them with proper jointed pipes. Now, this meant that the sewage and the wastewater didn't drain into the hill anymore, but it also meant, conversely, that the groundwater didn't drain into the sewers. And in fact, the sewers were probably acting as drains and stabilizing the hill. So when they replaced all the sewers, it actually made it worse, and the movements continued. In the end, 135 houses either collapsed or had to be demolished, and it's still the worst urban landslide in the UK. And without any other use for the land, they decided to turn it into public open space, and Hedgemead Park was opened in 1889. It was extended 5 years later when they compulsory purchased a number of other houses and basically extended the park, and that's why the park's there today. If you look at it from the air, Camden Crescent and Hedgemead Park is actually just part of a much larger slip known as the Beacon Hill slip that comes all the way around here. And this building known as the Towers sits at the foot of a steep slope. It's wooded, and that's the backscarp of this landslide. And you can see the street pattern actually picks out the contours on the disturbed mass. Now, if you look at it from above, you can see this crescent-shaped woodland area. Now, that's very classic of the urban slips and around Bath. But if you get rid of all the houses and the vegetation using the magic LiDAR, then you can see really what's going on in the ground. You can see the backscarp very nicely there, and you can see the disturbed nature of the whole slope down to the river, which is in white. I zoom out slightly, you can see the whole slip mass there. It's pretty obvious where it is. And it's thought these slips occurred in the late Vensian because of rapid downcutting from the River Avon. The River Avon had been sort of greatly increased when Lake Trowbridge burst through the Limply-Stoke Valley. And so the catchment was much bigger, a lot more water, lots of downcutting. These slips were formed. And then later on, because it's still trying to reach equilibrium, there are still slips, the Camden Crescent, the Hedgemead slip, and another one here I've shown this picture, the Perfect View slip. So periodically there are slips, and they're always triggered by either changes in water, like leaking drains and sewers, or leaking water mains, or changes to the groundwater regime, or people building or cutting, something like that, changing loading. If you look at a 3D sort of oblique picture, you can really see how well the Beacon Hill slip shows on the side of that hill, with Camden Crescent shown there for reference. And then I drop over this 1796 map. You can see this is a planning map. So this shows what was supposed to be planned. This is the final, what Camden Crescent was going to look like. And it's going up there into this bowl-shaped failure. Another map of 1795, curiously a year earlier, actually shows what was built. And this is the remains of Camden Crescent, and there are two separate houses there, which were subsequently demolished. By the time we get to 1823, you can see those houses are gone. They're still shown as potential, but they were never built. And there's a lot more development coming up the side of the hill. And then as you look at the modern day map, you can see the whole hill is now built over, apart from the very steepest slope. And finally, draping the aerial photograph over the top, just to show you what it looks like if you were to sort of fly over it. Now, there's Beacon Hill. If you zoom out, you can see the limit of the built-up area there shown in red. But there are quite a number of other large slips, and they're all on the outsides of meanders of the River Avon. As I say, this is where the Avon used to come before it came up that way. And if I drop on the BGS mass movement layer, you can see there's even more landslide areas than you can detect quite quickly using the LiDAR. Now, I mentioned the valley bulge, and valley bulging was always suspected for the River Avon, but no one had ever seen it until it just so happened in 1995. I organised a field trip for the engineering group at the Geological Society, and one of the places we went to visit was the construction site for the Bath Eastern Bypass. This is down by the river. The river comes through here, and that bit there, lo and behold, is the an exposure of the valley bulge. We didn't know it was going to be there, and I don't think even the people on site knew it was there. We just bumped into it when we got there. This is what we saw. Top picture, long panorama, and you can see how all the strata are contorted all the way along. Excuse me, I have a sip of water. Increase my pore pressures. And if you look at this bit here, I've just dashed on here, these isoclinal folds are in what is actually supposed to be horizontally bedded lias clay. So you can see the power of the valley bulge. And so this is all disturbed. This is all far weaker than it would be under normal circumstances. But unfortunately, you can't see it anymore. It's buried here. So bit of a shame, but we know where to dig if you want to see it again. The last thing I want to talk about is the legacy of Bathstone mining. Now, for those of you who are on Morris's trip in the summer, this is the Lewis bolt in action being used to lift this block. And you might ask, where did all the Bathstone come from? Well, this is the suburb of Coombe Down. And it's one of these hilltops just to the south of Bath, flat top with a oolite, Coombe Down oolite in this case. And it's a nice leafy suburban area. But if you get rid of all the buildings, you can see a number of old disused quarries, quite a few of them everywhere you look, and some of them are actually partially backfilled. But what happened in 1731 is they went underground and they started mining with pillar and stool mining, and something like an 85% extraction ratio, which is a really large amount to take away. This is a plan that shows 3,700 pillars they left behind supporting the ground. Now, this was all forgotten about and abandoned in the 1800s, and the Victorians came along and built over the top, as did more recent people. And it wasn't until sort of 1980s that it was suddenly realized that there was quite a major risk of collapse. And there were 650 properties with 1,600 inhabitants and a range of major services, roads and gas and electricity and all these sort of things that were at risk. On the left is a photograph of the first crown hole collapse that occurred in the 1990s. On the right is a picture I took in 95 in Summer Lane. This was actually a site where they were excavating out the workings so that they could then backfill it and build some houses on the top. And you can see the pillar, and you can see how close the voids are to the surface of the ground. And these are some pictures taken underground when it was still legal to go in, before the mining regulations changed. And you can see some massive great voids. You can see a robbed pillar here on the right, not much holding the roof up. My colleagues who were in there at the time told me they could hear people's televisions, they could hear various things going on, the traffic above. And in some instances, there's no more than 2 meters of rock between the top of the void and someone's lounge carpet. So obviously a major problem, and cutting a very long story short, this is what happened. So it's basically, here's a random 100-meter square I've taken from the mine plan on the Ordnance Survey map, and you can see all the green areas are pillars, the red is roof collapse, and all the white is actually open void, like you get on the right-hand side here. And then the only way in was to actually mine your way in using modern mining methods. So the roadways are shown here in red, and we mined in and then backfilled everything in between with a product known as foamed concrete. This shows the problem. There's about 8 meters of mined material, some of it backfilled with old discards and rubbish and fine material not wanted by the miners. Originally, access was through the quarries, now backfilled. We've got all sorts of features like damaged, robbed pillars, sagging roofs, etc. And so the new mining was carried out, and all the work was done from within these mines. And here's some of the roadways on the left, using timber supports originally, and then later on they moved over to using steel supports. And at the peak, there are about 200 Welsh miners who were employed on this job. And here they are on the left, fixing the shuttering. And then in the middle, there's a concrete or cement grout, really, batched on surface and pumped underground. And then on the right-hand side, just before it's discharged into the void, a foaming agent is added. So when it goes off, it has the texture of sort of aero chocolate, really. It doesn't need to be very strong. It just needs to fill the void. So putting air in it actually just saves them out of cement, which is expensive and makes it even more costly if you've got nearly 600,000 cubic meters to deal with. And so it took about 10 years. Having had 10 years thinking about it, then 10 years action, it was 170 million pounds for the contracting work. And those of you who live there may remember it finished just sometime before Christmas 2009. This is the area that they backfilled in purple and pink. And the little red splodges are roof collapses, and the orange circles are a number of old shafts that were discovered during the works. There's a fair amount of environmental issues, not least the bats. And on the left-hand side, they are now being provided with a sprayed concrete lined bat roost with nice rough surfaces for them to hang on. And in the bottom, at one stage, there was even a heated incubator to try and persuade them out of the depths of the mine into the bits that they were allowed in, and they then sealed off the rest behind them. There's also a lot of archaeology, and this is a plan showing some of the archaeological work that was carried out, again, when it was legal to go in, and a great number of finds. These are different quarry areas that the archaeologists divided up into in a sort of greeny colour, but all the little red coloured dots and green dots and pink dots and purple dots, they're all different types of archaeological finds. And they're all catalogues, and you can look at the catalogue online. And here's some of the things that were found, including at the top in the middle, the now infamous Lewis bolt. There is also graffiti. I thought you'd like this one. This is called the Gentleman with Genitals, and it's supposed to represent the quarry owner of Coombe Down. So just to finish, next time you venture up onto Alexandra Park, maybe to sort of get a good view across the city, or perhaps have your photograph taken overlooking the city, spare a thought for some of the geological localities that contribute to the influencing the development of Bath. And while you're standing there, you will be standing on the crest of Beach and Cliff, which is another one of these large landslides, echoing the one at Beacon Hill across the other side of the valley. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Kevin.